Welcome, everybody, to the final Oceanside chat of 2024 for VSG, the Viterbi Startup Garage. For those of you who have come to our Oceanside chats all year, welcome back. We love seeing you. And for those of you who are joining us for the first time, you really picked a great one. But let me tell you a little bit about the Viterbi Startup Garage before I introduce our very amazing speaker. So VSG is an incubator for early stage tech startups in Los Angeles. It is an in-person residency program where teams come and incubate with us for a full year. We take teams in the spring and we take teams in the fall. Our spring 2025 application will go live early next year. So if you're an early stage team and are looking to incubate and meet a bunch of founders and get a bunch of resources through USC, by all means, apply. We do these Oceanside chats as a public service to our extended VSG family. And today's Oceanside chat is on commercializing deep tech. Our speaker today is Joe Wilson. He's the managing partner at Undeterred Capital, with companies spanning from applied robotics, biological platforms, and health technologies. He has nearly a decade of experience in deep tech, and he's learned how to turn groundbreaking innovations into market-ready solutions. He also co-founded Multiply Labs, which is a pharma robotics company that was born from his time at MIT. And he successfully guided numerous startups through the complex journey of research to market, which, you know, if you are a faculty founder, I'm sure you can understand how challenging that is. I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to Joe to, give us maybe more color on his background and start his presentation. Thank you for joining us today, Joe.
Thanks so much. And appreciate you having me. Always enjoy giving these talks. I think today, certainly, I'm going to walk through a few different things. I'm going to walk through, my background, kind of how our firm thinks about deep tech broadly, and then get into some of the steps or some of the takeaways in terms of commercializing deep tech. Certainly feel free to interrupt with questions. Please let me know as those pop up. Certainly want to make this as interactive as possible. And whether it's about, stories about my journey, how I got from A to B, or stories about any of the takeaways or questions about any of the takeaways, let me know as well. As I mentioned, I'm going to start by talking about my journey, how I ended up as kind of running an early stage deep tech fund here in Los Angeles. Then I'll dig into a little bit more of founding companies as well as funding these companies before getting into the details around commercializing research. And then, as I mentioned throughout, Q&A would be great. I'm currently the founder and managing partner of Undeterred Capital. As a firm, we really focus on being that first check for entrepreneurs that are making scientific or that have made scientific or technological breakthroughs and are looking to really turn that into early commercial traction. We've invested in 24 companies to date, in two major areas. The first is what we call applied robotics, and the second is what we call biological platforms. But we've done everything from chemistry automation to fish processing robotic systems to AI for drug discovery to organoids for screening immunotherapy candidates to asteroid mining. So it's been a kind of a wide number of companies. The commonality is we're always one of, if not the first check-in. I think more than half of our founders we met before they'd even incorporated their companies. And we've been the first investor in about 2/3 of those companies. So we love to get involved early. We love to work on very technical teams on the commercialization side, and we're excited to do so. In terms of my journey, when I was younger, I kind of loved to hear about others' stories and how they got from A to B, even if that wasn't really that applicable to what I was doing. In my case, I didn't come from an engineering background. I studied public policy at Duke, which is kind of the equivalent of their business major. Spent a summer on Capitol Hill, working on clean energy legislation that ultimately failed. While I was there, discovered government politics wasn't really for me. I wanted something that I think was a little bit more where I could have more of a direct impact on the day-to-day that could ultimately impacted a lot of people down the line. So my senior year kind of switched my focus to really kind of center on emerging technologies. Joined a consulting firm called Accenture, helped start their digital strategy practice back in 2011. Worked in Atlanta and in Amsterdam on various projects. A couple years in, decided I wanted to start a company, but based on where I was, didn't have like a natural network of people to start that company with. Saw an opportunity at MIT to join their MBA program. Thought there is no better place on earth than Cambridge for kind of identifying these new ideas, especially around what I was thinking of as like foundational technologies, but and would later call kind of deep tech. But technologies that, if successful, would really lay the groundwork for entirely new industries. And so applied and was accepted into MIT. Arrived on campus several months early to help run MIT Startup Accelerator program, which was called Delta V, or that was really focused on commercializing deep tech startups. Helped run that during the summer of 2015, and then shortly thereafter founded my first company, Multiply Labs, in late 2015. I founded the company with a couple PhD students, who one was a PhD in robotics, another was a PhD in pharmaceutical science, who had an idea for creating a personalized pharmaceutical. What that meant was the early prototype was us 3D printing pills. And by varying the thickness of these pills, as well as developing robotic systems to deposit precise amounts of powder, we could really tune a pharmaceutical, a medication to fit an individual's profile. So full customization is kind of what the vision was and is. So we founded that company, spun it out of MIT in 2016. Were accepted into Y Combinator that spring, and then moved out west to build the company. Happy to share more stories or learnings there if they come up on like that early journey going through YC, what that was like. But after going through Y Combinator, we raised a few $1 million to help build out both our robotic system and our early production facility. And that's where I spent the bulk of my time over the next several years. I was COO of Multiply Labs. We built this robotic production facility, got it approved by the state of California for producing pharmaceuticals. Built very kind of bleeding edge robotic systems, and then kind of scaled those up over time and into early commercial contracts. A lot of learnings from those days, a lot of interesting lessons, like the good, the bad, and the ugly with building a deep tech company, especially one that required a good amount of capital to get going. But I think like one of the major lessons for me was, although we had some really supportive investors, there weren't really any who knew how to build companies like this, who knew kind of the core ways to de-risk these companies, and what to kind of the red lines to focus on and the mistakes to avoid as we were scaling up. So I took this lesson with me, left Multiply at the end of 2018 to move down to Los Angeles. And that's when I started on the venture side of things. I was a venture partner at an early stage bio fund called Mars Bio, where I helped partner with founders, and kind of thought about what company I wanted to start next. That was really the path that I thought I was on, was kind of a forever entrepreneur. But ended up getting hooked by the venture side. I enjoyed working with founders. I had done that for almost a decade before at this point. Enjoyed working with founders, enjoyed thinking through some of these problems, thought I could add a lot of value in those early days. And so in mid 2020, decided to start my own venture firm to really execute on what I saw as the gap in this market. Specifically, that was this, what I called kind of a commercialization gap. A number of groups could maybe help on the science or the technical side. But what I discovered was most entrepreneurs didn't really need that help. They're already the best in the world at what they were doing, either on the technical side or the scientific side. But where they did need assistance was on commercializing that technology, especially for like complex industries. And so started Undeterred Capital with that as the core focus. We raised a small fund at the end of 2020, started investing then. First fund we invested in 17 companies, really early stage. That grew into a larger fund. Our latest fund was $30 million that we raised this past spring. We've now invested in 8 companies out of that fund. So overall 25 companies across the 2 funds. It's been an interesting journey. Like we're now a team of 3. I think it'll probably stay small forever, but the bulk of our time is now spent identifying high potential companies, investing in those companies, and then supporting them as they grow and as they expand. So that's a little bit of my journey. Maybe I'll take a quick pause there, see if there are any questions I can answer.
There's nothing in the chat, but I do have a question. You know, in your early stage development, what's maybe something like a little underrated in terms of how to manage going from research to commercialized business? You know, there's all of these really great support resources, people who are trying to give you the business acumen or go to market strategies, but maybe something like that you learned that made it a little easier that you don't hear very often, or something that was maybe unique to your team early.
I think most technical founders have a pretty good sense of reasonable timelines to develop products and get them out to market. I think on the customer side, sometimes there's a little bit more wariness about engaging with customers too soon or moving too fast. I think customer development is very much a game of starting the conversations as quickly as possible, engaging them with getting feedback from them. Really, a huge amount of your time should be spent like thinking about who your technology is designed for. What needs are you addressing of theirs? And the companies that I've seen that have really broken out have a really fast feedback cycle there. And so that's maybe one of the more difficult things to learn early on, is like how to put what seems like an inordinate amount of effort into those early commercialization conversations, into those early partner conversations, and really think about it as a partnership rather than a customer you're selling to. Because the reality is, like, some of those conversations can take years to come together. But if you start the clock early, you know, it really comes to fruition at the right time. So yeah, I think a lot of that falls into the bucket of like doing things outside of maybe your comfort zone or that you've done before, rather than focusing purely on the tech.
Yeah, I find often with the more technical founders that there's like an element of like perfectionism, or not necessarily wanting to show the thing before the thing is ready to be seen. And so that early engagement with customers is like put off because there's just always more like retooling that can be done, or more, you know, work that can be placed before you start to engage. And I think that that's a big misconception. So yeah, I appreciate that.
Yeah, unless you can reasonably like pull a stranger off the street, show them your demo, and they say, "Oh my God, that's an incredible demo." Your demo is probably not that amazing. And so like waiting, kind of continuing to refine an early version because you're expecting to blow people away is almost always a mistake.
Thanks, that's perfect.
Excellent. Okay. So this is like, you know, I know I've covered a little bit of this already. Actually, I'm going to talk a little bit less about this. I think maybe I'll get into the founding of the company a little bit more, just because I know that was an early question. Yeah, I think for, you know, I'll get into some of the specific tactics later, but I think some of the founding a deep tech company, some of the things that like surprised me are one, just how iterative the process is overall. Two, you know, you're going to get a lot of feedback as you're building a company, some from investors, some from advisors. And I think like the best founders I've seen are really good at like collecting a lot of feedback and then kind of being a constant weighing machine based on who is giving good feedback versus less relevant feedback. And the only way you know what's good feedback versus not that good feedback is to kind of solicit it from a number of people and understand like why they're pulling in different directions. Ultimately, like the product vision is yours, the technology is yours, the company is yours. And so because of that, the decisions are yours. But soliciting from a wider kind of base of feedback early on, and then kind of correlating who gives the best feedback and then doubling down on theirs, I think was also like an important tool we learned. Because something, especially with companies that are a bit more unusual, you will get like radically different feedback and sometimes contrasting feedback. And the worst thing that can happen is like you get stuck taking feedback from someone who doesn't really know what they're talking about. So I think that's like something that we learned in the early days of like building Multiply was like who to kind of whose advice to give more weight to versus others. Um, the second thing, and this gets to a lot of like the technical progress that we discussed. You know, we at Multiply we had a couple rounds where we went out to fundraise and discovered that although these investors would say the robotics we developed were literally best in class, better than what any sort of pharmaceutical company had developed, we hadn't really de-risked the commercial side of the business. Um, and so I think that was another kind of hard-earned lesson was almost regardless of how much you think you've de-risked things on the commercial side, on the customer discovery side, there's always more work to do there and to really over-index. Um, I see a question from Kagan. So Kagan, go ahead.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. I have a question. I mean, deep tech is very hard for market entry, and also it requires a lot of investments for the early stages, right? So what would be the but there should be also advantages for the investors. I mean, they should have some reasons to invest on deep tech investments. I mean, what would be their motivations for the deep tech investments?
Well, I mean, good deep tech investors are investing in deep tech because it has a significant return on investment possibility. Like I mean, if you're investing and that's not your aim, then you're probably not a good investor. So like at the end of the day, we see like the companies we invest in, we see major kind of outperformance potential. Like when you think of some of the largest companies in the world, they're deep tech companies. When you think about the early story of NVIDIA, or the early story of Google or Tesla or SpaceX, or dozens of other companies, or OpenAI, like many of these companies that are now worth hundreds of billions or trillions of dollars, many of them are deep tech stories. And so there are certainly big companies to be created in software, but I think there were equally big companies, if not bigger companies, to be created in deep tech. So those are the sorts of companies we're looking to back.
Yeah, I mean, if I can also add, like, I feel like there's an appetite, investors have different appetites. Some investors are looking for a return on their investment relatively soon, which is why B2B SaaS models work really well because it's quick go to market, you can pivot very quickly, it's just like a quick return. Whereas I mean, I think like to Kagan's point, those long lead cycles to go to market and to finally start seeing a return, like
Yeah,
certain investors just don't have the appetite for that.
especially for medtechs, especially for the medtech and deep tech kind of things, because there's a lot of regulations, and maybe if you're lucky, your market entry will be 5 or 6 years later in some cases.
Yeah, I mean, listen, I think the time to market should be really kind of correlated with the upside opportunity and the predictability of it, right? So like those are all factors here. So if you are starting a deep tech company, it doesn't require any approval, but it requires 5 years to get to market because it's a technically complex product. That should have an enormous market and virtually no risk on the customer side. It like 5 years of R&D is
Yeah.
a really long time on the product development side. That's roughly the amount of time that OpenAI spent on their transformer technology before they launched their commercial products. So like I view those as like very few and far between. If you're talking about a regulated product in med tech or in kind of classic biotech, those have a longer time to market. But the reason it's kind of more viable there is because it's very predictable. It's like if you are able to clear these milestones, there's certain value appreciation correlated with each of those steps. And so I think sometimes founders get mixed up because they say, oh, X company took 7 years before they launched a product, and Y company, was able to raise this much money before they even went into clinical trials. And I think it's important to view like a lot of these venture investments are exceptions in some way, either because like they're founders who have done it before and like have other wins under their belt, or there's commercial deals that they haven't publicized that happened earlier. So, it's important to remember all those things. It's pretty rare to come across a company with a really long path to market where the commercial viability is in question, and when there's no kind of regulatory barriers. It's a more unusual situation for a company to raise a lot of money.
I see. Thank you.
Of course. Ryan.
Yeah, thank you so much, Joey. So I have a question. If you're a deep tech company and first-time founder, then what should we do? Like, we won a couple of grants so far, like from NASA, from Department of Transportation, from NSF, but still we have problem, first of all, launching a deep tech AI spatial intelligence, product in a way that the customer can buy and subscribe it, right? But at the same time, these fundings that we have are kind of limited. So with the compute, so we got compute power, but we need a lot more compute. So what should we do as a first-time founder? Maybe AI expert. So we don't need to bring expertise, but we need a lot of compute and other resources.
Yeah, I think what investors like to see is the amount of progress you've been able to make with a comparatively small amount of resources. I think investors are a bit more skeptical of the pitches that are like, I'm going to make a ton of progress as soon as you give me $50 million, right? It's much more impressive, and where we're typically really impressed is when we meet a company and they say, we've only raised $100,000 or $200,000, but we've already developed our product. It's already live. We already have kind of early customers. We've made a ton of progress with basically no funding. One of our investments from earlier this year in the robotic sector was like that. They had raised $200,000, but they had deployed their systems live with farmers, and we're working alongside them to deploy it in a wider way. So I guess the more practical answer to your question is like, how much progress can you make with less funding? Like, maybe it won't fulfill your entire dream, but is there a version of the product that you want to build that's possible with the funding you have?
So we did already that, and with no raising money, external money, we build the product, it's live. So what's your recommendation to do it now? Like, what should be, let's say, if we are in this scenario, and we have enough funding to survive 1 year. I don't have that problem because of non-diluted money. But in order to scale and dominate the market, I don't think we can just rely on the grants.
Yeah, the next step then is getting early customers. And then when you have early customers, leveraging those into more customers. I think that flywheel is a good way to get started. I know it's like an uninspiring answer, but that's the reality. It's like you either to especially, and again, not every company needs to raise venture money. It's a very particular path. But if that is the goal that you want, if you are interested in pursuing a multi-billion-dollar outcome, then the two kind of levers at your disposal are get more customer traction, or burn down technical risk further, and essentially make your product more impressive, which will then feed into getting more customers. So it all comes back to customers at the end of the day. And you don't have funding to go after the big stuff. Your MVP should have a way of pulling in early people, because that's what investors are looking for, right? Investors aren't some hidden genius. They're people like everyone else. But to make an investment, they have to have validation that customers really, really want this. And they have to say okay, these dollars are going to good use to build a big business. And it's tough to see that for most investors unless there's data to respond to or customers to talk to.
Thank you. So we have 2 pilot projects with one big company and one with the city of Los Angeles. So but these contracts would take time, to be completed. We started 3 months ago. So it's going to go and complete it somehow. But then when would be a good time for raising? So let's say that we completed that, we're signing a contract. It's not going to be a big contract, but they're first clients, right? They're taking risks, so they get discounted pricing. So is it a right timing to go and raise, let's say, our Series seed, or should we even directly go to Series A in that situation? And can we go to Series A without having lots of, revenues?
It's especially in this market, pretty unusual to raise a Series A without revenue. Most of the time what we're seeing, and there's a big range, but like anywhere from $500,000 in annual recurring revenue up to 3 or 4 million is kind of the typical Series A range. So if you don't fit into that bucket, it's just a bigger impetus on, it puts more emphasis on the technology, on the differentiation, on the team, if they've built and kind of exited big companies before. It puts more impetus on that part of it. So it is more difficult. For a seed, I think when you think you've got something, so to speak, when you think like if you have contracts already with the city of Los Angeles, well, the next question is like, is your target customer similar to the city of Los Angeles? Are you setting up additional cities next? If so, are those cities in the pipeline? Where are they in the process? Are they going to be able to close in the next quarter? If not, what's preventing them from closing? How do you go from 3 cities to 50 cities? How do you go from 50 to 500? What does that process look like? How much capital do you need to do that? What sort of new products you need to introduce in order to get there? What's the average contract value on each of those contracts? How are they going to expand over time? What's the approval process? So like those are like the first questions that venture investors will ask at the seed, is getting more resolution on like what that customer flow looks like, on that, what that go-to-market motion looks like. So if you can answer those questions, if you can, and again, you don't have to have perfect resolution, but if you can answer those questions, if you've got good data behind you, probably time for a seed raise.
Thank you. And how much is their seed these days? So what's the definition of seed these days?
I mean, anywhere from $500,000 to 5 million, I think is like that's the approximate raise.
Okay.
AI companies, we see some raising more. But yeah, the sweet spot anywhere from, 1 to 3 million, I think is the plurality of the rounds.
Thank you. And evaluations, usually how much it is for these seed rounds? Like
Huge range.
average.
Yeah, huge range. Anywhere from, on the very low end, a few $1 million post-money valuation. On the high end, 30 million, that's probably the range. I mean, typically founders think about it in terms of how much dilution they want to take on, and that's anywhere from 10% to 50%.
Joe,
Thank
since we're on that topic right now, maybe if you could just spend a minute talking about how, let's say, the transition or the continuum between pre-seed to seed, and you've already kind of discussed Series A. I think that will be helpful for Ryan's question.
Yeah, absolutely. So, pre-seed is closer to, you're at kind of the concept level. And again, it's different if you're talking about SaaS or you're talking about AI, or if you're talking about deep tech. I think in deep tech, again, like what we like to see is companies that have achieved technological or scientific breakthroughs. So even if they're really early on the go-to-market side, even if they don't yet have customers, typically the technology is built, some version of it is live. We're able to look at that and kind of underwrite either on the bio or the robotics side, how novel this solution is and whether it solves a customer pain point. That's a lot of what we're looking for at the pre-seed. Pre-seed rounds are kind of at the lower range that I mentioned earlier. So those are anywhere from maybe $500,000 up to a couple million is a good range for those. And again, there's overlap here. And seed rounds, you'll see maybe closer to that 1.5 to 5 million range. And there are bigger ones. There are $10 million seed rounds. There are $50 million seed rounds. But I think that's about the right range. But at the seed, though, those really get into some of the questions that that Ryan was asking and that we were discussing. Like it's much more is focused on, okay, so you've got something that's really interesting. How have your early conversations gone with customers? Is there a path at this seed round, if you're live, to go from early interest, early letters of intent, to a full kind of 6-figure contracts by the time you go out to raise the Series A. Like, what's the path to get there? And importantly, not just like what the first number is, but let's say things go well, how big can this contract be 2 or 3 years down the line? So those are the questions you want to be in a position to answer, to start to answer at the seed, and then to kind of have answered by the A.
Thank you.
Of course. I would say as well, just for like a market check here in December of 2024, I think the funding environment is much more robust at the early stages than it was a couple years ago when we were going through the correction. A lot of firms deploying in deep tech right now. We help run a platform called Deep Checks, where you're able to submit your deck, and it automatically gets routed to a few dozen venture capital firms. So even if you don't have kind of a built-in network, it's an easy way to kind of get your deck in front of more people. So I think like what we've seen there is there are a lot of investors that are actively investing right now, especially at the earliest stages. So I would say the sentiment is pretty good, especially compared to a couple years ago.
Just a quick check on your deck. You've not cycled through any slides yet, right?
I am a few slides in. Is it still just showing the first one?
It was just the first one. I had a suspicion, but you were talking so much about your beginnings that I was like, well, maybe he's still on that first one. I wanted to give it a beat before I suggested.
Okay, let's try.
I have a follow-up to kind of that conversation. You had touched upon the value of team. And, with a lot of these deep tech teams, obviously, in order to just get to a place where you're developing an MVP, you have the technical knowledge. You're coming in strong, which also probably means you're a first-time founder. What value or interest or importance would you place on getting something like a fractional CEO or somebody on the team that maybe can help build out more of that like experience in business that early stage investors want to see? Or is it something that you don't need and it's, because you're probably going to give up a good deal of equity to pull somebody like that in, especially if they have a lot of experience and are going to help you. So is there like, what's the trade-off there? Like, is that something that teams like this should pursue early?
I don't think so. I mean, I think there's 2 ways to think about it. The first is like the value created by those sorts of hires. And the second is like how investors perceive those sorts of hires. I think in terms of value added, it's normally pretty lacking, especially for like any sort of like interim CEO candidate. The reality is like those people aren't fully in it. They're not founders in the same way. It doesn't feel existential to them. And so the progress is normally lacking. Like they may have some founding or corporate experience, but like in terms of actually being able to like drive the company along, the value we see at least is normally pretty minimal. And from the investor point of view, in part because of some of the observations that I just kind of listed, we're pretty skeptical about those sorts of arrangements. We much prefer founder-led companies of like the scientist and the technologist and the roboticist who actually made the breakthrough themselves. We view most of like the business side of it as like highly learnable, especially by people who are the smartest people of the world and like they're among the smartest people in the world and like their technical discipline. The one potential exception is if you're doing like pure play biotech, like if you're building a pharmaceutical company, there are venture investors who are both venture investors and people who are more familiar with taking those products to market. That wouldn't be the sort of company we would invest in for a lot of the same reasons, but like that's a little bit more common of a playbook. But if you find yourself, hey, I'm operating either bio or robotics, and we want to bring on an interim CEO, I'd be pretty skeptical of that.
Thanks.
Adarsh.
Yeah, thank you, Joe. Do you guys only invest in biotechnology and robotics, or are you also investing in like AI and software?
I mean, we invest in those things when they intersect with either robotics or bio. But we don't invest in any like just pure play software or pure play AI.
Thank you.
Yeah. Jeff?
I guess my question is, when we're talking about like deep tech, there's you're investing in some of these things that require very sophisticated and very like profound levels of knowledge about very specific, hard to sort of understand verticals or spaces. And so how do you say, look at, like, you have all these biotech companies that are trying to do AI drug discovery or whatever vertical you're looking at, and differentiate between this one is investable, this one is not, without sort of having a PhD in whatever, because you're talking to all these PhDs about, like, what signals are you looking for as you differentiate?
Well, it helps to have PhDs on board. So like our team has those PhDs to assess the opportunities. It is different. I mean, some of the opportunities you mentioned in drug discovery are quite different than, say, robotics, in terms of like being able to understand the position in the market and whether or not it's a viable approach. I would like AI and drug discovery is one of the more complex areas in terms of the problem space, the targets they're going after, whether the kind of the models they're building are proprietary, whether the data is proprietary, whether they actually have something special, or whether it is just kind of an unproven theory. So I would say like, our first step is always underwriting the tech and understanding like what's special here or what's different here. But we spend a ton of time underwriting the market too. So if they're right, if everything goes according to plan, how big is this potential outcome? And so we spend a lot of time with prospective customers underwriting that too. Because the worst thing in the world is you being right about the step change in terms of technological improvement, but discovering there aren't really customers for it on the other side. So that's where we spend a lot of time really kind of digging in and trying to understand more. So yeah, combination of like having some of those PhDs on board to assess some of those more niche areas in bio is part of it. And then of course, if we stumble in an area that into an area that we don't know particularly well, relying on our kind of extended network of outside advisors to give us their input as well.
So I also just added in the chat that let's save the rest of the questions till the end and let you get through this tech a little bit with us.
Totally. And I mean, I think this is phenomenal. Like if we just do questions, that's also totally fine. But I am going to, given I know we only have 15 minutes left or so, I'm going to skip to kind of the commercializing research side. And some of this will cover what we talked about before, but as before, feel free to still jump in with questions as you have them. Yeah, so I think like when you are looking at this, the three major questions, when you are looking to commercialize research, the three major questions to consider. One, I think this got cut off, is what stage of development is your technology? The second is what products can I reasonably develop with this? And the third, which we were just talking about, is like, is there a market for these products? Who is the buyer here? And so I think this does really help when thinking about like, okay, I've been doing research in a lab for the last 5 years. Is it time to spin this out? And a lot of it comes down to this, and this is a little bit different in bio, but how quickly can I turn this breakthrough into a real product? And if I do that, who will ultimately buy it? On the stage of development side, yeah, I think I've kind of listed the different stages here, from idea concept all the way through to production scale or product ready. Normally companies that we see, it's maybe number 2 or number 3. There is some supporting data that indicates this is the right direction. There's maybe been lab scale achieved, or there's like a minimum viable product. That's typically where academics or PhDs get comfortable enough to spin out their technology when there's something there that indicates they're heading in the right direction. And when the next stage of proof points is like, relatively concrete. When they know what they need to do to scale up the company further. And the rationale won't surprise any of you. If you're going to spend your next decade of your life doing this and building a company around it, you do want to have some data to support that. So stage of development is kind of the first factor that most people we look at, most kind of good entrepreneurs that we work with really take into account and then consider what it's going to take to get to production scale. On the product selection piece, this is, I think a lot of people get this advice, but don't be technology in search of a problem. When I was at Multiply, we met with an investor, and his line that he shared with us is Sand Hill Road is littered with breakthrough technology. And that's true. Like, you can have a week of meetings and just meet with companies that have made breakthroughs, and not invest in any of them. Most of our pitch meetings are companies that have made breakthroughs. We have 2,000, we see 2,000 pitch decks a year. We probably take 250 meetings a year with entrepreneurs. 80% of them involve breakthroughs in some way or another. So it's like a necessary but not sufficient condition. And so the question then is like, okay, how can we funnel these advantages in the technology into something that we can put in the hands of early customers and really move forward as a business. And then the third thing to consider is on the market, on the buyer side. Again, like, you don't want to spend a decade of your life building a company only to discover the market isn't that big if you're looking for a venture scale outcome. And so it's totally fine to start with the niche beachhead, but also thinking through like how that beachhead translate to a much bigger market, if you're right, I think is really important. And I think another thing to be wary of is, I think sometimes we see companies start in a niche area and then say, okay, after we do this, then we're going to get to a much bigger market. But to get to that much bigger product requires like a different product to be built. Like, another version of this is some companies start by doing consulting projects with customers that they ultimately want to sell products to. And while that may help pay the bills, and if you're just trying to build a profitable company, that's fine. It actually doesn't de-risk the market at all from a venture investor standpoint. Venture investors care much more about like the specific, you're like verifying that the product you're selling customers want, not that you have expertise in this industry. So just another thing to kind of press on when you're thinking about market and buyers. Commercializing research. So I'll in kind of some of the time we have left, I'll cover a few common mistakes and then like how to do it right, or at least how to think about doing it right. Common mistakes: misunderstanding what progress means, over-indexing on IP, and then one we've covered before, which is focusing solely on the tech. So the first is like understanding what progress is and isn't. So progress, I feel like that sometimes with early stage teams, they kind of say we've made some great progress, we've incorporated the company, we just won a pitch competition, we just added like X and Y advisors, we decided on like a great law firm. Great, like those are table stakes, and like, but don't really help move an investor along and aren't really progress for like a company. Like, most of those, incorporating company takes less than an hour, like, yes, do it, but like it's doesn't do much. Advisors are like, can be very important if it's like a highly regulated industry, or if there are some complex dynamics, or if it's difficult to get entry into early customers. But most of the time, like, the value there rounds down to zero. Winning pitch competitions, great for exposure, great to get some cash in the door. For venture investors, like, doesn't really matter. Again, because like a lot of pitch competitions are based on kind of committee approval, and venture firms like to think of themselves as more creative and bespoke than that. What progress actually is like fundamentally de-risking the tech or the science. And that's through additional research or experimentation, recruiting talented co-founders, like demonstrating that you can build a great team. That's absolutely progress. And then conducting early interviews, getting early LOIs, getting indications of interest. That's major progress. So if you're coming to the table with those things, those are a major step forward. And it's really important to focus your attention on what actually counts as progress, at least in the eyes of an investor versus doesn't. The second is over-indexing on IP. Again, lot of conversations with founders who say our IP is very well covered. We're working with X and Y grade law firm. We spent a ton of time. We've spent dozens or hundreds of hours writing the patents. We've gotten them submitted. We've gotten conditional approval. We've even gotten kind of full granting of the patent. Great, do all that stuff, but don't think it'll get you across the finish line with investors. It's another like necessary but not sufficient condition. I would view a company that didn't have IP protection, I would view that as a risk. But I never view IP as a satisfactory defense mechanism to prevent others from entering the market. I think there's plenty of creative ways around that. So I think like early founders, once they've made technical progress, spend a ton of time on IP, and I think a good amount of time is important, but that's not the same as demonstrating early customer demand. So be careful about over-indexing on that. And then the last thing, which I won't spend too much time on, is this tech tunnel vision, just because we've already talked about it quite a bit. It's while differentiated tech is a starting point, as it's written here, that's all it is. It's a great starting point. But don't kind of go heads down for years working on that at the expense of the customer side. So how to do it right? A few thoughts here. One, create a timeline and really stick to it. I think, there have been situations where we've been tracking and meeting with founders for over a year before we ultimately invested. The best indicator, the best kind of like flashing green light of like, you should invest in this company, is when they give a really ambitious timeline and then they hit it and they stick it and then they continue to grow. That is like, in some cases, that's about as close to like an instant funding as you can get. Is if you have a really ambitious goal, you achieve that, you're on track for another ambitious goal, you've done everything you said you wanted to do over the course of the year. That's extremely compelling. Other ways to do it right, surround yourself with people who have actually built companies recently before. Again, non-value add investors are truly a waste of time. So especially if you're spending a lot of time with advisors, I would say, as we talked about at the beginning, it takes some time to figure out like who those people are. But once you do, like really over-index on the ones you think provide good value, and spend more time with them as opposed to like kind of evenly distributing it. And then the last part is like get feedback early and often. And this also goes to kind of the weighing mechanism that I mentioned. But benchmarking your progress with people who are a few steps ahead of you. Ryan was asking about milestones for the seed and the A, talking to founders that have raised an A. What were their specific metrics? What do they have at different points? But also realize that like markets adjust. And so common mistake that I see founders make is they say, well, I just talked to this company, they raised a Series A and they only had 200K in revenue and they're an AI company. They raised that 3 years ago. AI's changed a lot in 3 years. That's what may have been novel then and could have been sufficient on the revenue side, probably isn't today. So it's really good to continually kind of benchmark your progress to understand whether or not you're on the right trajectory. So I'm gonna pause there. I think like that's a lot of what I wanted to cover on kind of the things to think about and how to get it right. But I'm imagine there could be more questions, so want to leave the last few minutes for that.
We had some questions kind of populate in the chat. Tansu, do you want to ask yours out loud? I'll give you a few seconds.
Yeah, sure. Let me open my camera. Okay, my question was actually pharmaceutical side is too complex, as you know, and it's requiring invasive things, and it needs to be get FDA approved and many things. What is your level for investment actually? I just wondered this one.
Yeah, we invest $500,000 to $1 million.
Okay, so the companies need to get approved, or it should be just like academic research, like patents and publications. Is it enough for you, or you expect more things?
It really is so dependent on the company. I mean, plenty of companies we fund only have early papers and early data. Certainly none of them have approvals yet. So yeah, it's really dependent on the market they're targeting, how robust their early data is, and what we think of the team.
Okay, good. Thank you.
We have another question from Karis. Are you available to ask?
Oh, yeah, sure. Yeah, it's Karis, by the way. The question was, what do you find first-time technical founders or scientists who have made these breakthroughs and capitalized them successfully have in common? That could be, you know, the human element or resources, infrastructure, knowledge, etc. And then any advice for, you know, aspiring scientists still testing their ideas.
I think the commonalities, they're just relentless. I think it's like, and they're not relentless because of others' expectations. They're relentless because like they have something that drives them forward. I think like a commonality in practice is like, and this happened an hour ago. I met with one of our companies in the diagnostic space that we've been fortunate to partner with the last 3 years now. You know, I was expecting they had some early clinical data. I was expecting kind of a nice normal readout. They'd blown it away. They had like truly some kind of what I consider breakthrough early data on their different assays. And the great founders always surprise you with how much they're able to do and what they're able to accomplish in a short period of time. And a lot of that just comes back to like this relentless focus. And so, you know, that's one, you know, the name of our firm is Undeterred. And I think that's because that's the quality we like to see in our founders.
Okay, cool. Thanks.
Yeah.
We have a question from Menachem from an old cohort. I'm always so happy to see him on the call. Menachem, go ahead and take it away.
Thank you. Hey, Celia, good to see you too. Thank you, Joe. This is very interesting and good insight. My question is, what's your thoughts on drones, and do you invest in DoD-focused startups?
We'll invest in any company that, you know, has a hardware element. We'll look at them for investment. We're not defense investors per se. We haven't done anything that's explicitly in that domain, but that's there's nothing that would like restrict us from doing that. I think like with drone companies and then like other similar industries that have maybe been around for a while, it's real, like differentiation is just very, very important. It can't be, you know, 20% better product specs. It needs to be kind of a step change on one of the dimensions, as well as like a pretty concrete go-to-market plan that understands the complexity of like a DoD procurement process. So that, you know, at a high level, that's how I think about drones. Is it would really, it needs to be kind of something dramatically different than what we've seen before.
Cool. Thank you. I'd love to find some time to chat. Sounds like, yeah, sounds like we have a lot to talk about.
Excellent.
I don't see any more questions in the chat, but
I
Natalie
have a
raised.
question. So I'll be interning in like the regulatory review area, and I was wondering like if you've worked with multiply labs, and was wondering like how you look at platforms that are dependent on regulatory catalysts, and like how to move forward given that some things like have like a regulatory barrier.
Yeah, I mean, it is dependent on like what sort of regulation we're talking about and like how well understood that regulatory pathway is. So the more novel the regulatory path is, the more difficult it is for us to kind of underwrite. But if it's a well understood pathway, if there have been similar either devices or, you know, drugs that have gone to market, that makes it easier. I would say on like the kind of the earliest stage side, you know, I think one important thing is like universities really being collaborative and really kind of setting companies up to be successful. Rather than any specific terms, I think the most helpful thing there is just to be predictable and responsive. I think if you do that in any sort of like university ecosystem as like if you're a tech transfer office, that is far better than 90% of the tech transfer offices. So that's the main thing I would say, like even not really regulatory, but more kind of IP related. But yeah, on the regulatory side, it's just, I mean, it's certainly something we consider. Sometimes it's a major benefit if we think a company has a unique inroads to get approval where others may not, or unique knowledge. If it is kind of a more out there area. But yeah, those are some of the aspects we look at.
Can I piggyback on that? So just from your experience, Joe, what opportunities or resources did you take advantage of while you were at MIT in that early stage that maybe certain teams that are still associated with their universities can think about or ensure that they're not overlooking?
Yeah, I mean, like, you know, as much as I was kind of downplaying some of the pitch competitions in terms of like those being indicators of progress, they can provide early funding, which is super important to help kind of iterate through those early stages of company building. So that is important. A good amount of tech transfer office have like free office hours with law firms. That's a good way to get like a lot of your smaller questions answered and to also start to build a relationship there. I think that's important. At universities, the other big, very positive aspect is like you have some of the smartest practitioners in the world probably working a couple doors down from you. So like getting them on board, having them shoot holes in your idea, I think is also some on the technical side, I think is also something that's super valuable while you're still at university.
Very cool. Any more questions from the group? I mean, we're literally 1 minute over. We're perfect on time. Otherwise, I think if there aren't any, oh, Galen, you have a question? Oh, Galen, you're not muted, but I can't hear you. Maybe
You know what?
there you go. No, yeah, I
Never
can
mind. I think it's my headset.
I can hear you.
Sorry. About now. Okay, you can hear me. Sorry about that. Thank you, Joe. Quick question: hardware, deep tech, hardware-centric investors. Is there a region or any firms that come to mind, or a region in that's you think is more predisposed towards hardware investment in the deep tech space?
Increasingly LA. So I think that's been a big shift over the last few years as LA is becoming one of kind of the central nodes in the hardware space. But investors are all spread out. You know, we had an event last week with a few dozen VCs who invest in hardware, but they're from New York, they're from the Bay Area, they're from LA, they're from other cities. So it's no kind of single point of hardware investors regionally.
Okay, thank you.